Right, so fellow Ghanaians, very good evening to all of you, and thank you very much for joining us on UPfront on the Joy News channel. Now, this evening we have a very, very important conversation. Of course, the census is ongoing, and many of you have been counted. We've told about 85% of you have been counted. But there's another issue. You've asked the question, and so what? What happens when I get counted? This evening, we want to get answers to this particular question. And in getting answers to it, we want to understand how useful the data from the census, particularly that of the economic activities, could be used for. My name is Winston Amoa, and we're grateful that you're part of us. And this evening, we're privileged to have a man who's leading this whole activity. One who's ensuring that you and I are counted, but one who's also ensuring that we have the right data to be able to plan effectively for the country's development going forward. My guest, Professor Samuel Kobna-Inim, who is the government statistician. Good evening, and thank you very much for joining us.
Good evening, Winston, and thank you for having me.
I believe you're doing very well. I mean, I need to start on this note because there's been a lot of concerns over the last 4 or 5 days following that video over the weekend. How are you doing?
I am doing well. You are right. The incident last Sunday would send a lot of people concerned, given the responsibility that lies ahead of me with the 2021 Population and Housing Census. But thankfully, I am okay and I'm back to the office, although I'm working half day for the rest of the week.
Which means you've seen your doctor and he's giving you an all clear to work half day.
I would say that I've run 90% of the checks that needed to be run, and so far it's good. I did my last test yesterday and I'm yet to get the results.
Ghanaians are concerned. They say you need a lot of rest. While they admit you're doing a good job, they say, why don't you take enough rest?
I appreciate the concern, and as I indicated, I've heeded that advice, and that is why I'm working half day.
Great. Well, once you're well, it means that everything can be going on smoothly with the census. So far, how is it going? Before we get to, what it will be used for, and I'm very interested in the economic activity. But so far, how is it going?
I would say that so far the census taking has been very successful, in the sense that this is the first time we are doing a digital census, and we always characterize it by a fully digital census. And what that means is that in real time, as you rightly indicated in the introductory part of this show, that we have at the Ghana Statistical Service headquarters 85% of the data as at yesterday. So now we can begin to talk about what we should expect from the 2021 Population and Housing Census. Indeed, the activities that we've put forward for the rest of the week to mop up the exercise shows every indication that we are headed to counting every person in Ghana and taking the characteristics of all persons that we have in the country.
What percentage would constitute a successful census or counting?
Our target for the 2021 Population and Housing Census, as our slogan is, you count, get counted. And emphatically we say that it is an all-inclusive census. So if you ask of percentages, we are going for 100%.
But you know it will be difficult to achieve 100%.
For now, I'm putting the difficulty behind us, and we are saying that even for those that for some reason they do not want to participate in the census, we are deploying other interventions to ensure that everyone is counted. And for that reason, after the 2 weeks, we've set out only a 1 week initial mop-up phase. And going into tomorrow, we're going to do an assessment of where we are, and definitely we're going to have pockets of areas after Monday that we need to do targeted intervention. So as I indicated, although we appreciate the difficulty, although we say that it is a snapshot of the population, our target is 100%. And until we do that, we are not going to put our tools down as far as the 2021.
How would you know you've achieved 100%?
We do that from diverse perspectives. Let me start with the main criteria that we use in assessing the percentage of coverage from a scientific point of view. After every census undertaking, we do what is called a post-enumeration survey. The post-enumeration survey deploys superior interventions beyond what we do during the census period. So for instance, if during the census period we use 11 days for training, we're going to extend the number of training. The personnel that we use for the enumeration exercise, we're going to use our district field supervisors, our supervisors, to do the actual data collection. So we put in interventions that would make the post-enumeration survey have superiority characteristics over the census. So once we do that, based on the figures that we get from the post-enumeration survey, we are able to estimate the accuracy or the reliability of the figures that we are getting from the census exercise. Beyond that, prior to the census exercise, as you are aware, we did the chalking and listing of structures. So the chalking and listing of structures gives us an opportunity to take data on all structures in the country. And why we do that is to identify households and, more importantly, the persons that are in the household. One of the things that we've done uniquely for the 2021 Population Housing Census, unlike previous censuses, is that during the listing phase, we did not only chalk and list structures, but we collected information on usual persons who stay in the households. So as we speak, we have the de jure population based on the listing exercise. So that is going to be one of our benchmark indicators. Another benchmark that indicator that we are going to use is our 2010 population figure that we got, which was 24.7, and the projections that thereof we've done up till now. So that is also giving us a benchmark indicator by which we're going to assess the basis of those projections, the difference between a usual population and a de facto population, and also the post-enumeration survey that I talked about. So these three things would come together for us to make a determination on the accuracy of the figure that we are getting based on the de facto count.
Great. And so before we get into the economic activity and what that means, let's look at one thing. You talked about estimation. So you looked at all of these to have an estimation. We're going to be looking at you estimating the attainment of 100%. An estimation could be wrong. You would agree, right? Great. So there's a possibility of not achieving, but then estimating that you've achieved. Good. So let's get to...
I thought you wanted us to talk about that a little bit.
Okay, let's talk about that a little bit, yes.
I mean, what the post-enumeration survey does for us is to identify whether we have done an overcounting or undercounting. And in statistics or any estimation that you do, you give yourselves a margin of error.
Sure.
So you would want to say that I want to target a 1% margin of error, a 5% margin of error, a 10% margin of error. But as we speak now and we are doing the census taking, we are not accommodating anything like margin of error. It's after the post-enumeration survey that we're going to say that, okay, a 1% margin of error in these different types of areas can be accommodated, and in another place, given the different conditions, for instance, in a gated community, in a forest area, and so these are different characteristics that we have on the ground. So that is what is going to inform the variations that we're going to have in terms of the margin of error that we're going to put on it. And having said that, I mean, internationally, there is evidence across the globe in terms of coverage, population coverage that we've achieved in population and housing censuses. And as we speak, and we are saying that at the end of the 14th day, we've counted 85% of the population based on the listing exercise. Nothing stops us from targeting 100% from this counting that we are doing. Except
to say that in some areas, listing, some structures have still not been listed. And so if we're to base that on listing alone, and if you do not get the help of the population, you may be estimating wrongly because that particular structure has not been counted or listed as part of the structures.
Winston, you are absolutely right, and that is why in our press briefing yesterday we identified the top 15 districts that listing is still ongoing. Yes, based on our schedule, we said listing was going to take place between the 13th of June to the 27th of June, and today, the 15th of July, we are still doing listing. This is not coming to us as a surprise. Census activities is very huge, and in Ghana we have places that we've identified as fast-growing areas. If you go to places like Gan West, Gan North, Gan South, Gan East, Katamanso, these are places that within every month you'll be surprised the number of buildings that evolve. We did our demarcation exercise starting to 2019. So some of the places that listing is ongoing, we did anticipate that. And that is why in my earlier submission I said after the 11th we allow for an initial 1 week mop-up, knowing that with places like Gan West, Gan North, Lejokuku, Katamanso would have to do spot listing and enumeration moving forward.
So on this note, can I say for instance that you're not going to rest until you believe you've achieved 100%?
This is exactly what we are doing.
So after the initial mop-up, you could do another mop-up until you achieve 100%.
As I speak, today being Thursday and the numbers that I looked at this morning, I'm quite certain that we're going to go beyond Sunday, 18 July, in some selected areas in the places that I've talked about. Ayawaso West is not a fast-growing area, but people there, is difficult to reach out to them either because of their work or the environment. So this is an area that we have already started engaging to get a special task force to ensure that we enumerate them. So we have diverse reasons, and they are all pointing to the fact that we'll have to do some selected counting and enumeration from Sunday.
And wouldn't that, be problematic also, because you're looking at those who spent census night, 27th June, being counted as residents of a particular area. People may forget, and that's why initially you gave a 2-week period. So how do you factor that into it?
This is one of the notes that we are sending to our enumerators who are still in the field, trying to help us enumerate persons that we are targeting now. Initially, one of the indicators that we were using for people to recall the census night was the Accra House of Folk and the Kotoko March that happened on 27th. And I agree with you that between that time and now, over 2 weeks, over 3 weeks, recollection might be a challenge. So some of the things that we are beginning to let them be aware is that there have been some incidences since the 11th of July up until now, particularly the field clearance that is going on. And this is particular to the enumerators. So we tell them that if you go there, always remember that the field clearance started 2 weeks before the Accra House of Folk and Kotoko March, and get the respondents to identify with some other activities that occurred around the 27th. So you, the enumerator, will not be the only one using indicators, but try and get the respondent over a short period to try and use some other indicators to be sure that we are making reference to persons who slept in the house on 27th June 2021.
Great. So let's get to post-census, what the data could be used for. And I'm particularly interested in the economic activity. Now, I see that you asked the question, the past week prior to census night, whether you engaged in economic activity over that past week. And I am asking, so after that, why 1 week? What happens after that?
So let me start by the principles of quality statistics. And one of the principles of quality statistics is comparability, and the other is standardization. These are two different things. So when we talk about comparability, we are looking at the responses that we are getting from one household, one respondent, and how that can be compared with what another respondent is giving to you. And then if you extend the issue of comparability, you look at this across different geographical areas, typically across countries. So the International Labour Organization, for purposes of standardizing economic activity indicators across the globe, always would advise that you use the 7 days as the reference period, so that if we say unemployment in Ghana is, let's say, 3.1, and another country says it's 2.0, we know that the metadata, that is the documentation around the unemployment or economic activity, can be compared across the two countries. The other one, which is standardization, is if you ask the question without making reference to a particular period, I can say that in the last 1 year, these are the different types of economic activities that I've done. It's possible that in the last 1 year, I've moved in and out of economic activities, which we call the labor mobility. And it's difficult to also, from an anticipated point of view, say that after the last 7 days, I'm going to do A, B, C, D. It might take me 2 weeks to do it. It might take another person 3 weeks to do it. So what will be the basis for standardizing it? So for purposes of comparability and standardization, we make reference to the 7-day period prior to the census night. And thirdly is the issue of recall that you talked about. If you don't shorten the period and you make it 1 month, and people have done different types of economic activities, especially in a country where seasonality plays a major role, a country where the informal sector is huge, a country where contracting around work is not that strong, within a space of 1 month, 2 months, people move in and out of work. So it's always problematic to extend the duration for the reference period, and that is why we keep it at 7 days.
Exactly, people move in and out of work. And so once you capture that person as working, he moves out of work, but on paper, as part of our data, we see that person as working. So the question is, this data that we have, how representative is it when it comes to those engaged in economic activity?
Let me step back and immediately put up front the reason why we do a population and housing census. A population and housing census primarily is to take stock of the persons that we have in the country, and because you want to look at the characteristics of those persons and the living conditions, we add certain modules to it. Economic activity is not the main reason why we do a population and housing census.
Sure.
And that is why ahead of the 2021 population and housing census, we have put forward a results advocacy strategy which clearly spells out how we have to utilize this data, and moving forward, how persons in Ghana should look out for the needed indicators for each of the modules that we have in the 2021 population and housing census, of which economic activity is one of them. So for us at Ghana Statistical Service, we do not see this, and we would never recommend the use of the economic activity model in the population census as the only basis in prescribing policies in the labor market. So moving into 2022, for the first time, we're going to start the rolling out of a quarterly and an annual labor force survey. Indeed, a standalone labor force survey which would help us better understand what is happening. And in that quarterly labor force survey, as you indicated, we're going to follow the same cohort of people over time. And that is where we are going to see people that in the first quarter, they were in the services sector. In the second quarter, they were in the agriculture sector. In the third quarter, they were unemployed. And in the fourth quarter, they were in the industry sector. This is the only channel by which you can address the issue of labor mobility that you talked about. But you cannot talk about labor mobility in a census, which is a decennial activity. But it is important for the census to give us the needed base on which all the surveys will be run.
Exactly. I mean, you've made a point, but you've talked about, having to engage in a labor survey quarterly. If I look at the dates, the only time you had one was in 2016. We've done one in 2016. How sure are we that we're going to be able to achieve that quarterly?
It's pretty unfortunate that as a country, we've not been able to do more than one labor force survey. And our thinking was that beyond the 2016-2017 labor force survey, we would have continuously done something like that. Thankfully, given our financing arrangement now, we are able to set out at least quarterly labor force survey, and funds for that have already been earmarked. So in 2022 and 2023, we're going to do a 2-year quarterly labor force survey. My concern really is not about what is going to happen in 2022 and 2023. As I said, funds have been ring-fenced for that activity already. My concern is beyond 2023, whether data collection would be part of our integral part of what we do as a country, and make sure that 2 years ahead of time, as I'm talking about now, we are sure that this quarterly and annual labor force survey would not be a one-off thing like we had in the 2016-2017 labor force survey. So definitely we're going to have an 8-round data collection on labor force survey from 2022 and 2023.
And we'll get to the numbers shortly, because I'm interested in the numbers, because I'm looking at the numbers here and also ask the question whether this can be seen as a depiction of the situation on the ground. We're talking about that labor survey. That was in 2016. We know the Ghana Living Standard Survey was in 2014, and then 7 was in 2017. These also provided information on economic activity. They are used largely in determining, for instance, the employment and unemployment rate in the country. But if you look at these these two that I've talked about, because we are now waiting for the Population and Housing Census of 2021, can you say that this provides accurate data for the analysis of the employment and unemployment, and by extension, the economic activity in the country?
Definitely no. Definitely no. And I say that from 2 perspectives. One is how comprehensive these surveys are vis-a-vis what we need in terms of labor statistics. What we are talking about here is only the supply side. So once you do a household survey, such as the Living Standard Survey or the Labor Force Survey, you are tackling the problem only from the supply side point of view, in terms of those who are eligible to put forward their labor. The other side is the demand side, and the demand side is what is needed to run our industries, what are the skills that are needed, and you don't get that from the household side. You get that from the industry, the agri and the services side. That is what you're going to get, the demand side. Then the third area is all about policy and this whole discussion around job creation. Then you can go into the cost of recruitment and so on. So even if you put labor statistics into 4 categories, as I've just done, what we are getting from the household surveys, i.e. the Labor Force Survey and the Living Standard Survey, are tackling only the supply side and leaving out the policy side, the demand side, and also the cost associated with all these. The second one that I want to talk about has to do with the frequency of the data that we collected, which we touched on briefly. I'm happy you mentioned the Ghana Living Standard Survey and the Labor Force Survey, but let me stretch it a little bit to the 1984 census. So in the 1984 census, we got an indication on employment, unemployment. In the 2000 census, we got something on employment, unemployment. Then we had the GLSS 5, that is the 5th round of the Ghana Living Standard Survey in 2008, which also gave us something on employment and unemployment. 2010, we had the Population and Housing Census. 2014, the GLSS 6. 2016, the Labor Force Survey. And 2017, the 7th round of the Ghana Living Standard Survey. If you look at all these, now I'm focusing on only the demand side. The regularity, 1984, 2000, 2008, 2010, 2014. The intervals between these censuses and surveys would not help us as a country in any way to predict what we should see, even if you create 1 million jobs now.
Why wouldn't intervals help us?
Because of the irregularity in the intervals. So in 1984 to 2000, you have a 16-year window, so you don't get any data on employment, unemployment. Let me indicate that we had a GLSS 3, GLSS 4, but in between, you're talking about a 16-year period. Then between 2000 and 2008, you are not too sure whether the same set of policies in terms of magnitude that you instituted over the 16-year period will be the same that you are going to institute within the 8-year period. And even between 2008 and 2010, you have only 2-year window. Why do you compare policies within that 2-year window with a 16 and an 8-year window? So as a policy and as a good practice in statistics, you need to ensure, that is why I talked about comparability and standardization. You need to ensure that whatever data that you are collecting, you obey 2 principles. Either you follow the same cohort of persons over a regular period, and when you are compromising on following the same cohort of persons, at least ensure that the intervals between the surveys and the censuses are the same. And that is why the GLSS, by its design, that is the Ghana Living Standard Survey, we need to ensure that it is done every 5-year period. And that is why the census is a decennial activity. Because once you vary the intervals between them, you have challenges. If you want me to stretch this a little bit on the demand side, now what we are getting on the demand side is simply talking about issues of whether you are employed, whether you are unemployed. But even on the demand side, there are a lot more questions that we need to think about. Now we are talking about vulnerability to employment, vulnerability to unemployment.
Sure.
And we use indicators as basic as hours worked and whether there is a contract or not. But if you really want to understand the vulnerability to employment, you go beyond hours worked, you go beyond whether there is contract, and more importantly, look at the conditions of the contract to make a determination on the vulnerability of the employment. And even if you want to stretch that, you look at the competition associated that is coming in. Because even if my conditions of service for a particular point in time is good, and the competition that I'm getting from other sources is going to heighten the mobility across. So we see more extensive discussions on even the demand side alone, which currently we do not have it in the surveys and censuses that we are conducting.
So based on all of these, then the question is, have we been implementing the right policies? Because you've said, based on these intervals, the ability to know the impact of your policies is problematic. So what's been happening? Have you been implementing the right policies?
I would be hesitant to say no, but as a statistician, I would always look at the numbers and say and surmise whether the numbers suggest there's a policy influence or not. And from the numbers, I do not see the influence of policy in the numbers that we are getting. The reason why I say that is the GLSS 5 gave us an unemployment figure of 3.6. The GLSS 7, the GLSS 5 was in 2008. The GLSS 6, which was in 2013-2014, gave us an unemployment figure of 5.2. So we moved from 3.6 to 5.2. And the GLSS 7, that is the 2017 Labor Force Survey, gave us an unemployment of 8.4. So if you look at these only from the GLS, I don't want to muddy the discussion with what we're getting from the 1984 census, the 2000 census, and the 2010 census. So let's just stick to only the GLSS 7. 3.6, 5.2, 8.4.
You don't see the impact of policies?
I mean, if I want to see if one will see the impact of policies, then two things should have occurred. We should have seen a decline in unemployment, and we should have seen the decline in different dimensions based on the policies that are being instituted. So it's possible you could see a decline, but they would not coincide with where you are putting in the policies.
We'll get to the numbers. I mean, there's a very important conversation that we must have. The policies, I mean, the numbers are very important. We'll come to the numbers shortly. Because you've been hearing all the numbers about how we're reducing the unemployment rate and how the policies are working. This is Upfront on the Joy News channel, and tonight we're privileged to have the government statistician, Professor Samuel Kobene, helping us understand the usefulness of the numbers that we have, the data that you and I are so much concerned about. And so stay with us. When we return after these short messages, or this short break, we'll get into the numbers. And I know there are many of you who are interested in the numbers, just as I am. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Right, so welcome back from that short break. Thank you very much for staying with us here on Upfront on the Joy News channel, where tonight we're joined by the government statistician, Professor Samuel Kobene. And we're understanding, all the numbers, particularly when it comes to economic activity. We need data to plan, but can we trust the data that we have? That's the next leg of the conversation. Can we trust the data that we have? So, Prof, before we went for the break, you're talking about how if you look at the numbers, you wouldn't say, for instance, that policy is influencing, particularly the numbers that we have with employment or unemployment. We've also talked about how the intervals are not consistent. But let's look at one important thing as we get to focus on the numbers. The concern for many is this cannot be the true representation of the situation on the ground. You cannot tell us that, from 2017 Living Standard Survey, we're looking at a total of 8.4% of Ghanaians unemployed. They say that cannot be the situation. Because if we're to look at what's happening around, people picketing all the time and complaining, how can this be the reality?
Thank you very much. So it's important we always think about the definition of unemployment, and then we ask ourselves what is needed for us as a country given our context and what the international requirement is. So we have put the figure 8.4 as unemployment rate for 2017 based on the international definition for what unemployment is. So we are here talking about people who are not engaged in an economic activity, and people who are willing, are available, and indeed people who are seeking to perform some economic activity. On the flip side, we talk about somebody who is employed, and we say that somebody who, over the last 7 days of our reference period, that person would have worked for at least 1 hour. I do agree with people raising concerns as to why this is not reflective of what we have in the country. But this is why we always encourage further analysis with the data that we have. So we have put out there this 8.4% based on the parameters that I've put out. So if over the last 7 days somebody worked for 1 hour, that person would not be in our basket of unemployment. Which I do agree that it would be inadequate. The person might be in the informal sector, there wouldn't be any contract, and so on and so forth. So that is why anytime we have the unemployment figure for the international community for purposes of comparison, we also put out other indicators such as underemployment. And earlier on, I talked about vulnerability to unemployment. So even if you look at this, in the last Ghana Living Standard Survey, we calculated the underemployment using persons who worked less than 35 hours. But in my earlier submission, you recall that I say vulnerability to unemployment should go beyond hours worked, should go beyond whether there's a contract or not, and also begin to think about 2 other dimensions on top of my head, which I talked about, i.e. the conditions of the contract and the competition that we have in the economy, to really think about whether somebody's job is vulnerable, somebody's employment is vulnerable or otherwise. So we have some studies that we have experts in the country having looked at different dimensions of unemployment. And that is why in the last 2 years, we have started saying that it is not only the national figure that we're going to put out there. And we have designated statistics into 3 different levels: the experimental, the official, and the national, so that we will begin to understand unemployment from different perspectives, as I've just talked about. Unemployment as the headline figure, international standard, unemployment from the perspectives of underemployed, unemployment from the perspective of vulnerability, and more importantly, unemployment across different sectors. So we really need to begin to engage with statistics in much more detail than always running with the headline figure, unemployment. I always say that the aggregate figure is not a true reflection of what is happening. The detail is in the disaggregation. And that is where we need to go to now.
So by way of clarity, so we're saying that the 8.4% wouldn't be a true reflection of what's happening.
It's definitely a true reflection, but only at the national level. Only based on the strict definition that we've provided to unemployment.
So this is the true figure based on the strict definition of
Indeed, it's the strict definition of unemployment. Yes.
But if you were to look at the situation on the ground, it will be different.
Oh, indeed. Once we relax all that I talked about in terms of, remember I used 2 conditions in the definition: you are available to work and you are seeking for work. These are the conditions. So we can really define unemployment based on only availability, only based on seeking, or both. But the strict definition is that you are not engaged, you are available, and you are seeking.
And you must be how many years old?
I mean, the statistics that we put out there is 15 years or older. But when we are collecting the data, we start from 5 years. So if you look at our 2021 PAC and our previous censuses, in order to capture child labor, questions around economic activity start from 5 years. But the computation of unemployment rate is based on 15 years or older.
Great. I know you're still collecting data, but I mean, over the last few years, we've been told of how we've created, lots of jobs have been created. You've heard about the 2 million jobs being created by the government. You've heard about, and we know, for instance, that about 100,000 graduates, yes, they have jobs now. We're paying them for it. That's likely to affect the unemployment rate now if we're to go by what we have seen over the past few years, isn't it?
I mean, absolutely. 2 things. This is why I said that the disaggregation is the detail. If you look at youth unemployment rate, it's in the double digits. It's in the double digits as at 2017 when we're talking about 8.4 nationally. So youth unemployment between 15 to 35, between 15 to 24, both of them are in the double digits, respectively 12% and 18%, which is higher than the 8.4 that we are getting nationally. And that is why I said we always need to look at the disaggregation, i.e. age, i.e. sector, i.e. subsectors. This is what will help us target what we need. Stepping back with what you said earlier on, I do appreciate and commend the fact that efforts are being made to create jobs, which is the way to go. No one would contest that. But the question is, does job creation necessarily or automatically translate into a reduction in unemployment.
Does it?
It does not.
How?
Because of our earlier discussion on labor mobility. If you create jobs and you don't create the jobs, limiting those who can get into the jobs to those who are unemployed, and it's open for all of us who are already employed. That is the labor mobility that we talked about.
Yeah.
So if you create jobs and you end up getting those of us in employment moving from one job to the other, the unemployment rate will remain as it is. Because those who are unemployed, you are not getting them into the jobs that you are creating. Or if you put it differently, you didn't create the jobs having in mind the characteristics of those who are unemployed. And they would not be competed out or crowded out by those who are already in employment. So you can continue to create jobs, and all that we're going to see is mobility of labor and not necessarily reduction in unemployment rate.
How about targeting those who are unemployed?
So this is what I'm saying. If you do that, and which is a difficult thing to do because those who are unemployed should have a niche that those who are employed don't have. You get it? But if they don't have the niche and the returns to the job is more attractive than those who are employed are currently receiving, and it's open, they would easily move from one job to the other. And then one would ask, then the unemployed would fill the vacancies that have been created. But don't forget, this is like what we call a cobweb. Because once one group moves into it, there's another group of employed people who are going to move into it. So it's difficult to control both the skills and the geography around something.
But you say
like
you're going to be following the same cohort of persons in your labor survey. That should give you an idea what's happening to these persons.
Indeed, that is what is informing our dire need to do a standalone quarterly and annual labor force survey to understand the labor mobility that we have in the country. With all the censuses and surveys that we have, we don't have any idea of labor mobility in Ghana.
And how does that influence or impact our policies towards employment creation, since we don't have this?
I wouldn't be able to really speak to what has informed the job creation over the period because I'm not a policy maker. But as a statistician, I know that the statistics that we have now has not allowed us to do targeted interventions as far as employment is concerned. And what I mean by targeted employment interventions is to say that don't target only sector, don't target only age, don't target only education qualification. All these are correlates of employment. So if you really want to target employment, it's a combination of the age group that you are concerned about, if it's graduates, their education in terms of discipline, and the sectors that we need them in. So really, it's a combination of factors that would inform your decision to make targeted unemployment interventions. Otherwise, you can simply say that we have unemployment among the youth and put all youth together thinking that one size policy would fit for all youth, when you know that they've read different disciplines in their tertiary education. So we really need to do targeted unemployment interventions based on the correlates of the labor market statistics, i.e. education, sector of employment, age, and so on.
I'm just curious about something, and I just take you to these numbers because I'm looking at employment status from 2000 and 2010. So in 2000, for instance, we have employees 16%. In 2010, employees, those who are employees, 18%. Now, that clearly shows that there's been an improvement, some 2% jump. And then those who are self-employed without employees, 68%. By 2010, that reduces to 60.1. Self-employed with employees, 5.2, and that reduces to 4.9. Casual worker, that wasn't captured in 2000, is captured in 2010, 2%. Contributing family worker, 6.70%. Now, if you just look at these numbers, what does it tell you?
My immediate response to these numbers are that two things. You are doing a comparison between 2000 and 2010.
Yes.
And one, you are looking at the distribution across different employment status.
Yeah.
So on the surface, you can say that in this particular category, over time, the number employed have gone up, and in this particular category, it's gone down. Winston, this is exactly what we said. We can talk about that, but it's not too useful if we discuss this minus the policies that were instituted between 2000 and 2010. So for instance, if you take the issue of employee, which has gone up by 2%, can we identify a particular policy intervention over the 10-year period that led to the 2 percentage point increase? I would not engage in a conversation like that. The reason I wouldn't do that is, over that 10-year period, quite a number of policies have been instituted. And the census from 2000 and 2010, as I indicated earlier on, is just to give us a base on which we have to run surveys. And that is why we are talking about quarterly and annual labor. Because once it's quarterly, then for instance, we've done 1D, 1F in this particular year, and we've done it in these particular localities, and employee has gone up by this 2 percentage point, I can directly relate the 1D, 1F to the 2 percentage point increase in employee. But if you give me that 10-year window, and 1D, 1F has gone on, other interventions have gone on, some of them we don't remember, between 2000 and 2010, and I cannot determine the net effect. On what basis would I want to have a discussion on the 2 percentage point increase? It just becomes a number. So the census is just to provide us with a base. Then in the intercensal period, we strictly have to do the quarterly labor force survey following the same cohort of people.
And you're starting that when? The quarterly labor surveys, when are you starting that?
God willing, we start that next year, 2022.
Why not this year?
Because we are getting the census as the base. The census would give us the sampling frame for all the surveys that we're going to do. You cannot do a survey when you don't know the sampling frame. That will be the basis of your representation. And that is why it is recommended. So census is not just for policy direction, but census is the basis for which you do all surveys. So we cannot, indeed per our program 2 years ago, we are going to do the quarterly labor force survey in 2021. But for COVID, when we move census to this year, we've had to move all the other surveys to 2022 and thereof, because we need the census to provide that with the base. So that is the sampling frame.
Well, my guest is Professor Samuel Kobnenim. He's the government statistician. And this evening we're talking about the data on economic activity, what it means for you and for me also. So let's get back to one other thing, and I just would want to take you to, you made a point earlier. So you looked at the Living Standard Survey, in 2008, the unemployment rate was 3.6, then it increases to 5.3, and then reduces to 5.2, and then the labor force survey indicates 11.9%. That clearly should tell us that per the labor survey, which was a bit detailed, we understood the unemployment situation. Clearly an indication that the Living Standard Survey does not present the true picture for us.
Once again, thank you, Winston. And repeatedly, I'll talk about the need to look at the documentation around every survey that you do. You do recall that I talked about the 7-day reference period and the 15-year age cap for all the surveys and censuses that we do. If you are doing a standalone labor force survey, as I'm recommending that moving forward, that is what we are going to do, because it's a standalone labor force survey, you are able to do different categorizations of the reference period. 7-day reference period, 3-month reference period, and 12-month reference period if it is an annual labor force survey, in which case it was the case when we did the labor force survey in 2016. So in my earlier submission, I didn't want us to mix the surveys and the censuses when you talk about the statistics, because once you are talking about them and they are not using the same standard for the data collection, then comparability of the figures become problematic. So I talked about the GLSS 5 in 2008, which stood at 3.6, and the GLSS 6, which stood at 5.2, not 5.3, and the GLSS 7, which stood at 8.4. So taking only GSS as a standalone source of information for labor force, for unemployment indicators, we move from 3.6, 5.2, and 8.4. If you look at the figures for labor force survey, which stood at 11.9, indeed, that is the Second time, we're seeing a double-digit unemployment figure, and the first time was in the 2010 census, which we saw about 10.2 or so. And then in the 1984 census, we got 2.8.
2000, we saw 10.4.
10.4. And then the next double digit was 11.9. So it is always important to ask yourself whether the basis of comparison are the same. I am hesitant in using the labor force survey to compare the GLSS 7, the censuses, based on exactly what I've said to you, because all of them are using the 15-year gap, age cap, but when it comes to the reference period, the labor force survey allows us to do that. My main concern here is whether over the past 26 years, that is from 1984 to 2020, we are in a position to predict what unemployment would be moving forward. And with the variations, we have only 7 data points over this 26-year period. When in other jurisdictions, we are talking about 4 data points in every year when you are doing a quarterly labor force survey. So we are not in a position to predict unemployment figures because we simply do not have enough data points to tell us where we are headed, even when you are putting in policies.
Wow. But all that is, expected to change from next year, 2022.
Yes, that is what we've worked towards.
Let's get back to the census and find out what we should expect from it. You've told us that you're going to be continuing until you finally count the last person, until the last man is counted, based on your own estimations. What other outcomes are we expecting from this census?
We are looking forward to further engagement on the other 9 modules that we have in the 2021 Population and Housing Census. Our conversation so far has been restricted to the economic activity module, but the 2021 Population Housing Census has 9 other modules. I'm going to run you through 8 of them. The first one is the basis for doing all the comparisons in terms of the demographics. So we ask questions on sex, age, religious affiliation, ethnicity, and so on. Those indicators by themselves are not policy derivatives, but they give us basis to understand and to make a determination on what to target. But beyond the socio-demographic characteristics, we have a module on literacy and education, which for me it is extremely important, especially at a time that within the last 10 years we've made some major decisions on what should happen in our education sector. I think this is going to provide us data, and retrospectively we can look at, as we've just done for the economic activity, pull data from the 1984 census, the 2000 census, and all the surveys that we've done up until the last Ghana Living Standard survey, and integrate that data with the data that we are getting on performance from the Ministry of Education, Ghana Education Service for that matter.
Okay.
That is where we should be headed as a country. If we are collecting household data and it has nothing to do on performance or outcomes on education, and these 2 data sets sit on different platforms and we don't have a platform to bring them together, thankfully with the passage of the Statistical Service Act that sets up a statistical advisory committee, we are hoping that functionally we would be able to begin to integrate different data sources, i.e. the outputs or outcomes of education and what we have on the household side to better appreciate what we need to do in terms of policies. So we're going to further engage on this subject matter, literacy and education. The second module in there is the difficulties in performing activities, which for us is extremely important.
Why is that extremely important?
2 things. You don't want to leave anyone behind.
Sure.
And I always say that that is just the necessary condition. And why I say that is the sufficient condition is that you need to reach out to the farthest person, and the farthest person is not by geography, the farthest person is the deprived. So from the 2021 Population Housing Census, we're going to compute vulnerability to poverty, and we're going to compute vulnerability to multidimensional poverty. And we have in the questionnaire persons with difficulties in performing activities. We have other questions such as insurance, and also questions related to maternal and paternal orphanhood. These are indicators that we are going to pull together to begin to think about issues around vulnerability to poverty and multidimensional poverty, and people who have special circumstances, i.e. difficulties in performing activities, so that interventions can be targeted for them. And what is unique about is it is not just about whether you have a difficulty or not. We are capturing the extent of difficulty so that we can stagger the interventions and prioritize them based on the dimension of difficulty and where you find yourself. And that is why we say that that model is extremely important, especially when you correlate it with labor outcomes and education.
Sure. Okay. We get that. Let's get to the next model. What would that be?
The next model is on, we have the literacy and education, we have the difficulties in performing activities. We have a whole model that touches on we have three different models that touches on what we need to continue to project our population. So we have a model on migration, we have a model on fertility, and we have a model on mortality. I always start the conversation on migration, fertility, and mortality from a population projection point of view. Then quickly say that we need to disabuse our minds beyond they enabling us doing projections. For the first time, we are thinking about fertility and child survival. So when we talk about fertility, all that we think about is children ever born to a woman. But what we are not thinking about is child survival and people who are going to make it up in the next X number of years. So the fertility model, its irrelevance goes beyond children ever born for us to think about the children that are likely to die at a certain age. Then we have the mortality model, which looks at issues related to death from a social point of view, because we are doing this from the household and point of view. Then the two models that we have in there on housing and sanitation is really what we want to talk about as a country, especially when everybody is talking about housing deficit and just a small number of people are worried about the quality of housing. We can address the housing deficit, but to what extent are we thinking about how housing conditions are impacting on our health? Especially in the era of COVID-19, where everybody is talking about teleworking, we want people to go and work from home, and we are not thinking about the environment in which they have in their various houses. We want to focus
on the environments they have in their houses and the quality of the houses they're in.
The quality of their housing, which is important. Their cooking arrangement, the type of electricity that they are using. And these are things that we need to begin to focus on from a policy perspective. And for the first time, we've separated the sanitation model from the housing model. And by separating it, we are not just limiting ourselves to solid waste, we are talking about liquid waste as well. Means, modes by which they are dumping their refuse. And these are things that we think we need to begin to engage in, and that is why at the outset, we put out at least 100 ways by which the census data can be used. And that document has been targeted to various ministries, departments, and agencies. And as a statistical agency, we are hoping that the conversation around census will not end after the data collection exercise. And indeed, it has to run up until 2031 when we do our next population and housing census.
That will depend on you also. It depends on the data you provide to these ministries.
Winston, this is exactly what we are doing now. That is why I'm putting out there, ahead of the data, the resourcefulness. And all these are on our website. We have a special website for the 2021 Population and Housing Census. We have a tab on resources, and we are directing all MDAs, all MMDAs to go down there. That is why ahead of the census, we have physically visited all the regions, walked them through the data that we have prior to 2021, all in anticipation that we're going to whip up their interest and make decisions based on the data that we have.
Great. Well, Professor Samuel Koboneni, you need some rest, and so we'll have to end the conversation here. It's been glad having you join us this evening on Upfront on the Joy News channel. Thank you so much. And we'll come back when the data is ready, and we'll look at what the data means for our country, Ghana. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Folks, that'll be all from us this evening on Upfront on the Joy News channel. My name is Winston. I'm on behalf of the team. Thank you so much for being a part of us. Do have a lovely evening. Keep watching the Joy News channel. Catch you next week.